when a crisis is happening, people tend to have emotional responses and tend to be coming from a place of fear. And that tends to prevent people from thinking critically or calmly or rationally about situations or about policies. And so a lot of, during COVID, obviously a lot of focus was on COVID-19 itself, on the biosecurity situation, not just so much on the financial situation. But for example, if there was a major crisis going forward that would greatly impact Americans' ability to engage in economic activity or have their purchasing power, close to wiped out or something, I think you would see a lot of people really beg for any policy response. Solve this crisis now, we need something, and not really have people think about what is the best policy response. To this kind of crisis. People aren't going to think calmly and bring everything to the table, and it's very unlikely there will be some sort of calm, open public debate about it. Generally what happens is that the government says people are scared and emotional. They clamor for some sort of solution from the government, and the government offers some sort of solution. And, like with COVID-19, BlackRock anticipated the next downturn about a month before the repo market started going haywire, and presented to central bankers, this is the policy you should implement during the next downturn. And it's very possible that BlackRock is working on policy papers, for central bankers or other people in the U.S. government about what policy should be implemented if, this type of crisis happens or that type of crisis happens. It seems like they seem to be designing the policies, I guess. And they've, had, in the Biden administration over the past 4 years, they've been leading his former BlackRock executives have been leading his economic team, bringing us to where we are now, and likely influencing what will happen over the next couple of years whenever or up until this crisis emerges. So it seems, very likely that they'll be, dominating, fiscal response again. And then people, because they're not really aware of how this is developed, or really, there's just not a lot of media coverage about, for example, the role of BlackRock in the Biden administration, or in, on Kamala's economic team specifically. I've seen very little coverage, if any, of that. Recently, maybe a few blips here and there of when those people are appointed, but nothing significant beyond that. And then, of course, there was very little scrutiny of U.S. COVID fiscal response, I think, as well. And it's just sort of written off as this is what the government had to do to respond to the crisis in a lot of situations. But I don't think that's necessarily true, because, again, that fiscal response began well before, COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, preceding that by like several months, right? So I don't know. I think it's a complicated situation. It's complicated to anticipate what will exactly happen. But again, history tends to repeat itself in these cases. And the fact that you have BlackRock so embedded with the Democrats specifically, and also have this historical precedent with Trump when he was in office last time, it seems very likely that they'll be doing this again. So I guess my role in this is to try and generate awareness so we can have a discussion before that time of crisis, when people are emotional and afraid and concerned about their money, about whether we should be having BlackRock at the helm of this when the next crisis emerges. I would say no.
Yeah. Okay. So let's ask the obvious question. Who should be in charge in that moment? Who do we put in charge of fiscal policy in times of
Well,
crisis or otherwise?
I don't necessarily have the best answer to that, I guess, because I think our current system, specifically as it relates to, the U.S. Treasury Department, has consistently been a revolving door for the last several decades with Wall Street. And like Goldman Sachs, for example, has had very significant former Goldman Sachs executives have held very prominent roles at the Treasury when crises have emerged. So as an example, you have one of the top guys at Goldman Sachs, Robert Rubin, being a key figure in the Clinton administration's economic policy as Treasury Secretary, and helping engineer the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which creates, arguably the 2008 financial crisis, when George W. Bush's Secretary Treasury at the time the crisis happens is Henry Paulson, another former top guy from Goldman Sachs, that allegedly told members of Congress if they didn't bail out the banks that martial law may be declared in the United States, for example. And then when the COVID fiscal response happened, Steve Mnuchin is a former top Goldman Sachs executive as well. So in as far as, the big parties, Democrat and Republican, they tend to appoint people to Treasury that come from these top Wall Street banks that have a history of predatory and arguably criminal behavior. And so, I think there needs to be a much larger structural change, I guess, to prevent that type of revolving door policy if we're going to see any sort of meaningful fiscal response to a crisis that actually does take, the needs of regular Americans into account. Because historically, that is not what has happened. And the people that come to Treasury tend to have the best interest of Wall Street at heart and not the best interest of regular Americans at heart. And I think, again, that's sort of a phenomenon that's not exclusive to Treasury either. You have this type of revolving door phenomenon in really most aspects, if not all, of the U.S. government, where you sort of have regulatory capture, of the people supposedly regulating those industries. The industries themselves tend to have put their top people, at least these days, into those major regulatory positions through this revolving door phenomena. So I think we need to find a meaningful way to stop that before we can expect that major government fiscal response would be designed with the interest of regular Americans at heart, with Main Street at heart and not Wall Street at heart.
Okay, the question becomes, how do we do that? So walk me through, just so that we're not talking abstract stuff, we're really bringing it down to earth. What are the interests of Main Street or the average American?
Well, I think regular Americans would like to stop having their money stolen from them or being misused on things where it's basically being sent to enrich multinational corporations, particularly in the war industry, where you have a lot of, there's been a lot said over the past several years, decades really, about the military industrial complex and how a lot of the wars that U.S. empire goes to start in other countries
Whitney,
generates
I'm
a
gonna I'm
windfall of
gonna
profit.
stop you. I'm gonna stop you really fast, just because you know this stuff so well, that you'll fractal into 10 more extremely valid issues. But I want to start with, you just said regular Americans want to stop their money being stolen from them. I will say, I don't think the average American realizes that their money's being stolen. Whenever I bring that up, I feel like I'm screaming into the void. So how exactly are Americans' dollars being stolen from them?
Okay, I would say it's going to things that are not actually building necessary infrastructure or
Do you mean
meeting
tax?
Americans' needs.
So money's being taken
Well,
from them via tax and just
yeah, so
misspent?
yeah, I think taxpayer money has been people taxpayer wealth and the money brought in through taxes has been misused and essentially stolen for a very long time. If you look at the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and Mark Skidmore, for example, they noted that like $21 trillion of U.S. taxpayer money essentially was stolen, and they can't really explain what happened to it. So that alone is very
When
significant.
let me ask, is taxation in and of itself theft?
Um, I mean, I think under the current system, because if anyone's familiar with my work in my books, for example, I sort of argue that our government has been overtaken by this network of organized crime and intelligence agencies that have essentially fused their operations and did so in the immediate post-World War II era. And I think financing their operations when they're at the helm is not good, and that the fact that our money is being taken from us ostensibly to provide services to us, and if you believe in the development agenda abroad, the rest of the world. But we know, if you look into it, that that's not actually what is happening. This money is being used to benefit this particular group that has taken control of our institutions and is very corrupt. I think in that case, yes, it's not good at all. In an ideal system, perhaps I'd have a different opinion, but that's not the system we have as it is right now. So I think, in this situation, we need to really look at how our taxpayer money is being spent. And a lot of it is spent on weapons. A lot of it is being sent to other countries with no, stipulations on how that money is used, no oversight. An insane amount of money was spent on quote unquote nation building during the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, with really nothing to show for it. And arguably, and some people have really effectively argued that it was really a money laundering operation at the end of the day, a way to sort of take taxpayer money and then have it go to the hands of these contractors and other entities, and it ends up elsewhere with nothing to show for it in these particular situations. And I think there's plenty of waste and plenty of examples also in the US domestically where contractors have been given taxpayer money to do things and they don't actually do the things that they're supposed to do. And there's really very little accountability for those things when they happen because a lot of people aren't really aware or really follow up on where their taxpayer money is going. And there's a lot of trust that I think people have placed in congressional representatives that they're going to do that due diligence for them. But most people in Congress are multimillionaires who are funded by billionaires and multi-billionaires and tend to have the interests of those people at heart and not exactly, the regular Americans who were in a very different economic situation than them at heart. And so I think also, over the past several decades, we've also had the situation of, outsourcing our industry, to other countries beginning during, or really not exactly sure where to pinpoint it, but, several decades ago. And that has also obviously had a major impact on the United States as well. And I think there's a major effort from the Silicon Valley crowd, oligarchs of which fund both parties to sort of onboard I guess you could say, the American people into sort of this new system that's coming into place where it's sort of very focused on or this basic, I guess, sort of this coming together of digital IDs, digital wallets, UBI. A lot of these things are sort of being slowly developed and sort of like promoted to people. But I think ultimately, you would only have that type of situation where UBI is necessary.
I just want to make sure that we go point by point right now. Okay, so all of that makes sense to me. But I want to go back because when I think about what the interests of the average American are, it's I want to be able to take care of my family. I want things to come in at a reasonable cost. I want to be able to save for the future. I want to leave something for my kids, and I want to make sure that my kids have a better future than I have. I feel like if you have that for the vast majority of any nation, I literally think it's completely agnostic. I think that's just what humans crave.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
If you have that for people, you will have a healthy, thriving society. Assuming we're in agreement with all of that, even if you're BlackRock and you're super greedy, it does not make sense to hollow out the middle class because eventually, as history teaches us, they come for you. And when they come for you, they come with pitchforks and guillotines, and it's not a good look. So what is it about this moment where the elite are so deranged that they are, from where I'm sitting, playing with fire? Do they just think that we're so stupid that we'll never rebel? Are they counting on this time will be different because they have more control? I don't understand why they would do this.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly why, but I think it's important to say that at least in my opinion, I think where the powers that be, however you want to define that, are taking people is essentially leading us to some sort of two-tier society where there is really no need for a middle class, and it's really more accurately described as like a neo-feudal style society where you have a large underclass managed by sort of this more elite group that would do the managing. And I think it really falls under what some people have referred to as technocracy, sort of this idea of more of like a scientific dictatorship. And there's actually this prominent figure from the Club of Rome named Dennis Meadows, and the Club of Rome is an entity that has a very intertwined history with groups that have become infamous over the past several years, like the World Economic Forum, for example. But Dennis Meadows essentially said something to the effect that, for the good of people and the planet and the economy, and in his words, that it was going to be necessary to either reduce the world's population so that people could have freedom and use resources the way they want, or that there would have to be a scientific dictatorship imposed on 8 billion or 7 billion people in order to ensure accurate allocation of resources and all of this stuff by a educated, technocratic, scientific elite. And there are some thinkers in Silicon Valley, like Eric Schmidt, for example, who wrote a book on AI with Henry Kissinger, that essentially say that there's going to be this sort of future brought to us by AI, where there will be the class of people that understand how AI works, that program and maintain it. And then there will be this underclass, really, they don't say underclass, but I would say that, of people who AI acts upon, who can't understand what AI is doing to them. And eventually, because of their dependence on AI, will become cognitively diminished and mentally unable, essentially, to make decisions for themselves without AI's help. And there's a lot of other indications, I would argue, whether it's UBI, which again is going to be for not, I don't think, the top oligarchs in Silicon Valley, like Bill Gates and Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel, are going to be receiving UBI. I think it's intended to be for other people that aren't necessarily in that economic tier. I think it's very likely you're going to see, if these people succeed in their designs, really more of a two-tier society without any sort of need for a middle class. And so I think that's part of why it's been happening. And I think, as to why they might be playing with fire, I think perhaps they're confident that they have a lot more, that it's much easier to manipulate people now than perhaps in times past. For example, there was a 2014 research study that was funded by the US Air Force that was about studying how to use social media to control people like drones. Which I think is a very disturbing research proposal in and of itself. But basically this idea that you could use social media networks by tailoring what information people see and don't see down to the individual based on data mined about them off of the internet and then analyzed by various algorithms to basically, essentially mind control people, and, in the world, in the words, I guess, of that Air Force proposal. And, other militaries around the world have spent millions upon millions of dollars over the past decade plus researching how to manipulate people on social media platforms. So I think it's very possible that they think they can manage it, since a lot of discourse has become increasingly online, and that they can really alter how people perceive reality to unprecedented degrees. And another thing that's brought up in this book by Schmidt and Kissinger talks about, eventually people won't be able to know what's real and what's not, either pointing to things like AI deepfakes and things like that. But what if these deepfakes are wielded by the state to manipulate people? And what if we're led to believe that things happened when they didn't happen? This can be a lot of the fear mongering about deepfakes is when it's in the hands of, an alleged cyber criminal or someone like that. But, there's states around the world that have an arsenal of these digital weapons that are meant to manipulate us in our perception of reality and what's real. And if you can, use AI or other means to control how people perceive reality, you can control their behavior and a lot of other things. So I think they're confident in that. And obviously there's probably other things that I'm leaving out, but that's, sort of what comes to mind, at least at first for me, when in regards to that question.
Is that all? One of my notes is, this is dark. This is very dark. So that I can get a barometer on your worldview, let me ask you, which of the following scenarios would be better? AI comes into existence. It has what, from our perspective, is godlike intellect. It really does know where best to allocate resources to people to maximize human flourishing. But you have to completely submit to the algorithm. Okay, so human flourishing maximized, yay, but you have no autonomy. You do what the algorithm tells you to do. Or the sort of messiness of the human experience, freedom first, you have every right to make stupid and self-destructive decisions. But you don't get to take advantage, obviously, of the algorithm's brilliance. Which of those two would be better?
Yeah, I am definitely human first. In that when you put it like in these two, specific situations, I think it's kind of dangerous for all of us to, or all of us, a lot of us to outsource our creative ability to AI, have AI create for us, because essentially when you're not performing those activities yourselves, it's sort of falls under if you don't use it, you lose it paradigm. So like a lot of us don't really do mental math anymore because we all most people have a calculator in their smartphone, for example. And so, you don't use that ability, eventually you lose it. So what happens if AI becomes, the main generator of creative content and people forget how to make art because they haven't done it in so long and things like that? I think it's possible. I know there's people I've talked to who I think are very intelligent that argue for sort of a middle scenario between the two you pointed out. I personally tend to fall in a more sort of like I prefer for the analog future to a purely digital future personally. But I think there's a way to do it where we don't really have this situation where the AI algorithm is running our lives and we don't have any agency anymore. I think that's very dangerous. And I think also there's been a lot of hype about AI and its ability to reach that sort of godlike intellect level. I think it's very possible that you could have that essentially faked by some entity and they could claim that, which has happened in the past. You had a Google engineer, or perhaps ex-Google engineer a few years ago, attempt to say that a chatbot that he was working with was sentient, and it was not. So there's the possibility that someone could come out with that story, and if it was widely adopted and enough people said it was, it could be believed to be so, and wouldn't it actually be that? And in that type of scenario, I think that's dangerous because it sort of gives this Wizard of Oz functionality, for example, to the government. We made this policy, you hate it, and but the computer said so, so that's why we did it. It's the computer's fault, it's not our fault. It's a way to sort of offshore responsibility onto the algorithm and away from the people at the top. And I don't really think that's the way to go personally. But I'm not trying to say like eliminate AI and don't use it. I personally am not into it, but I have a lot of friends that are. And so I'm not trying to be like that negative about it in that sense. But I also think this whole idea that we should surrender ourselves to the algorithm because it's so much more intelligent than us, which is sort of implicit in that Eric Schmidt Kissinger book. Yeah, I definitely don't agree with that at all because I think humans should not surrender their agency. And I think it's sort of in that scenario I sort of just laid out, if it's overhyped and it's claimed that it reached that, people could surrender their agency to something that isn't actually possessing this godlike super intelligence, and but have just been told it is. And I think that potentially could be very dangerous.
If you like that clip, check out the full powerful episode here, and I'll see you there.